That's all it took. 40 seconds to eliminate 12 armed guards without firing a single shot. No bullets, no grenades, just a piece of wire and hands that knew exactly where to put it. The Pentagon classified this operation so fast, the ink wasn't even dry on the after-action report. Why? What happened in that Cambodian jungle in April 1969 that two governments agreed should never see the light of day? I'm going to tell you right now. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about Special Forces, about who the real elite operators were in Vietnam, and about a rivalry between American and Australian soldiers that Washington has been covering up for over 50 years. You've heard of the Navy SEALs, you've heard of the Green Berets, but have you ever heard of a sheep farmer from Queensland who became so deadly? The Viet Cong gave him a name that translates to jungle ghost, a man who could lie motionless for 16 hours while enemy soldiers literally urinated on his hiding spot and never flinched. The kill ratio tells the story. American Special Forces, 15-1. 50-1 on a good day. Australian SAS, 500-1. That's not a typo. 500 enemy combatants for every single Australian operator lost. The Pentagon saw those numbers and refused to believe them. They sent investigators. They demanded explanations. What they found was so disturbing, they buried it. 200 yards from safety. Ammunition completely exhausted. A helicopter waiting with its rotors turning. And between Sergeant David McAllister and that extraction bird, 12 North Vietnamese guards who had no idea that death was already moving through the jungle behind them. What happened next was erased from every official record. The men who witnessed it were told to forget. The pilot who flew that mission? His name appears in no document that survived. But I've got the story. The real story. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Australian SAS were the most feared operators in Vietnam, and why America pretended they didn't exist. Stay with me. This one's gonna leave you speechless. The wire cut through cartilage with a sound like wet rope snapping. Sergeant David Dingo McAllister didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. 11 more guards stood between him and the extraction point, and his ammunition had run dry 17 minutes ago in a firefight that should have ended his life. The jungle night wrapped around him like a funeral shroud, humid and suffocating, as he lowered the first body into the elephant grass without making a single blade rustle. 200 yards ahead, a Huey waited with its rotors turning. 200 yards of North Vietnamese Army checkpoints, trip flares, and men who would love nothing more than to parade an Australian SAS operator's corpse through Hanoi. But this was only the first of 12, and the clock was ticking. What happened over the next 40 seconds would become one of the most classified incidents of the entire Vietnam War. The American liaison officer who witnessed it from the tree line would spend 3 decades trying to get the Pentagon to acknowledge what he saw. They never did. The Australian War Memorial has no record of this operation. The official squadron history mentions only that Sergeant McAllister received a commendation for gallantry in April of 1969, with no further details provided. The real story, however, was far too dangerous to tell. This is the story of how a sheep farmer from Queensland became the most feared silent operator of the Vietnam conflict. How a piece of wire taken from a dead Viet Cong sapper transformed close-quarters combat doctrine. And why American Special Forces commanders quietly requested Australian SAS attachments for their most sensitive operations, then buried the paperwork when those operations succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. But to understand what happened in those 40 seconds, we need to go back to the red dust of a Queensland cattle station, back to an Aboriginal tracker named Billy Doolan, who saw something in young McAllister that no one else recognized, back to the brutal selection course that broke 93% of applicants, and back to secrets that 2 governments agreed should never see the light of day. The telegram arrived at the McAllister station on the 14th of March, 1966. David was elbow-deep in a sheep's birth canal, trying to turn a breech lamb, when his mother walked across the paddock with an envelope that would change everything. He was 22 years old, stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, and weighed 173 pounds of lean muscle, built by 16 years of working one of the most unforgiving properties in Western Queensland. He had never been to Sydney. He had never seen the ocean. He had never fired anything more powerful than his grandfather's Lee Enfield rifle at dingoes, threatening the flock. The telegram informed him that his application to the Australian Army had been accepted, and that he was to report to Kapuka in 14 days for basic training. What the telegram didn't mention would alter the course of military history. A recruitment sergeant named Patterson had written 3 words on McAllister's file that would determine his entire military trajectory. Possible SAS material. Patterson had met McAllister at an agricultural show in Longreach 8 months earlier. The young farmer had won a shooting competition using iron sights at distances that made the Army range instructors uncomfortable. But that wasn't what caught Patterson's attention. It was what happened after the competition, when a drunk stockman started a fight with McAllister over a perceived slight. The young farmer didn't swing, didn't shout. He simply moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone his size, put the stockman on the ground with a technique Patterson didn't recognize, and walked away without looking back. When Patterson asked where he'd learned to fight, McAllister shrugged and said something about a blackfella who worked his father's station. That blackfella was Billy Doolin, and the fighting technique was just the beginning of what he'd taught the young grazier's son. But the true nature of those lessons wouldn't become clear for years. Patterson made some calls. The Special Air Service Regiment was expanding its recruitment, looking specifically for men who could operate in the jungle environment of Southeast Asia. They wanted bushmen. They wanted hunters. They wanted Australians who understood that the outback had been preparing them for a war they didn't know was coming. David McAllister was exactly what they were looking for. He just didn't know it yet. Basic training at Kapuka lasted 10 weeks and presented no challenge whatsoever to a man who had been mustering cattle in 45-degree heat since he was old enough to sit a horse. The drill instructors tried to break him with physical punishment, but McAllister had already been broken and rebuilt by the Queensland bush. They tried to intimidate him with shouting, but he'd spent his childhood being educated by a man who communicated primarily through silence and disappointment. By the 6th week, his file contained 17 separate notations recommending him for Special Forces selection. And then came the order that shocked everyone. He wasn't going to infantry school. He wasn't going to artillery or armor or any of the conventional assignments. He was going directly to Campbell Barracks in Perth for Special Air Service selection. This was almost unheard of. Most SAS candidates had years of conventional military experience before attempting the selection course. McAllister had 10 weeks. The commanding officer at Kapuka wrote a formal objection, arguing that sending an untested recruit to selection was setting him up for failure and potentially dangerous to his psychological well-being. The response from Campbell Barracks was terse. Send him. What happened next would become legend within the regiment. The SAS selection course in 1966 was designed to identify men who could operate behind enemy lines for extended periods without support, resupply, or rescue. The physical requirements were brutal but straightforward. Candidates had to complete forced marches of up to 60 kilometers, carrying packs weighing over 40 kilograms through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Western Australia. Of the 114 men who began selection in McAllister's intake, only 8 would complete the course. But the physical challenges were only the first filter. What truly separated SAS operators from ordinary soldiers was psychological. The regiment wanted men who could make life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure, who could function alone in hostile environments for weeks without losing their edge, and who could do things that would break most human beings without being broken themselves. McAllister moved through this crucible like water finding its level. He didn't fight the deprivation or resist the psychological pressure. He simply adapted to it, finding a stillness within himself that the selection cadre had rarely seen. One instructor, a sergeant major named Thompson who had survived 3 years of jungle warfare in Malaya, wrote in his evaluation that McAllister seemed to enter a state of consciousness that is difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable. He becomes the environment rather than fighting against it. This is the quality we need for Vietnam. But the tracking and evasion phase was where everything changed. Candidates were released into the bush with minimal supplies and hunted by veteran operators using dogs and vehicles. Most lasted between 6 and 18 hours before being captured. The record at the time was 47 hours, set by a corporal who later perished in Borneo. McAllister evaded capture for 93 hours. When the selection cadre finally called off the exercise due to time constraints, they found him within 400 meters of where he'd been released. He had circled back to the one place they never thought to look. He had constructed a hide so perfect that the tracking dogs walked directly over it without alerting. He had survived on what he later described as bush tucker, that Billy taught me to find, including insects, roots, and the moisture from certain plants that the Aboriginal peoples had been using for 40,000 years. When asked why he hadn't tried to put more distance between himself and his pursuers, McAllister gave an answer that would be quoted in SAS training materials for decades. A hunted animal runs. A hunter waits. Those 6 words would later save his life in Cambodia. The training that followed selection was intensive, specialized, and increasingly focused on the jungle environment of Southeast Asia. By early 1967, Australian forces were fully committed to the Vietnam conflict, and the SAS regiment was conducting operations that made American Special Forces commanders simultaneously envious and uncomfortable. The Australian approach to counterinsurgency was fundamentally different from American doctrine. Where American forces relied on massive firepower, helicopter mobility, and search and destroy operations involving hundreds of troops, the Australians worked in small patrols of 5 or 6 men who could remain in the jungle for weeks at a time. They didn't try to dominate the terrain through force. They infiltrated it. They became part of it. And the results made Pentagon analysts question their own data. During the entire Vietnam conflict, Australian SAS patrols achieved an estimated kill ratio of 500 to 1. 500 enemy combatants eliminated for every Australian SAS operator lost. American Special Forces units operating in the same theater during the same period achieved ratios between 15 to 1 and 50 to 1, depending on the unit and the operation. The disparity was so extreme that Pentagon analysts initially assumed the Australian figures were propaganda or record-keeping errors. They were neither. The Australians were simply better at this particular kind of war. But the methods that made them better were methods that Washington preferred not to acknowledge. The fourth factor was the most controversial, and it's the one that explains why the Pentagon classified what they learned about Australian methods. The Australians taught their operators to think like hunters rather than soldiers. They used tracking techniques adapted from Aboriginal tradition. They studied animal behavior to understand how humans move through dense vegetation. They learned to control their heart rate, their breathing, and their scent to become effectively invisible to enemy patrols that passed within meters of their positions. And they developed close-quarters combat techniques that were designed not for military engagements, but for silent elimination. The wire technique was one of these, and David McAllister would become its most accomplished practitioner. He learned it from a sergeant named Cooley, who had developed it during operations in Borneo against Indonesian infiltrators. The principle was simple. A length of wire, properly applied, could sever the trachea, the carotid arteries, and the jugular veins simultaneously, causing immediate incapacitation within seconds. Unlike a knife, which required specific angles and sufficient force to penetrate clothing and tissue, the wire worked through constriction and leverage. Most importantly, the technique was almost completely silent. McAllister discovered that captured Viet Cong demolition wire, the type used to connect detonators to explosive charges, had properties that made it superior for close-quarters work. It was thinner, allowing it to cut faster. It was coated with a rubberized compound that provided better grip. And it was strong enough to withstand the forces generated during rapid application without breaking. He began collecting these wires from enemy bodies. His pack eventually contained over a dozen lengths, each cut to precisely 114 centimeters, each with small wooden handles fashioned from bamboo secured to the ends. The other members of his patrol thought he was developing an unhealthy obsession. They had no idea how right they were, or how that obsession would save all their lives. McAllister arrived in Vietnam in August of 1967, assigned to 3 Squadron Special Air Service Regiment, based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province. His first impression of the country was the smell. Diesel fuel and rotting vegetation and something else underneath. Something that he would later learn was the particular odor of human decomposition in tropical humidity. His second impression was the Americans. They were everywhere. Nui Dat was technically an Australian base, but American helicopters flew constant patterns overhead. American advisors wandered through the Tactical Operations Center, and American supply convoys clogged the roads leading to the perimeter. They were loud, they were confident, and they looked at the Australian SAS operators with a mixture of curiosity and condescension that bordered on contempt. McAllister's patrol commander, a captain named Harrington, who had already completed 2 tours, gave the new arrivals some advice on his first night in country. The Yanks think we're Bush League because we don't have their toys. Let them think it. When they need something done quiet, they'll come asking. Within 6 weeks, the asking began, and what the Americans witnessed would challenge everything they believed about warfare. The first operation that brought McAllister to American attention was a reconnaissance mission in the Longhai Hills, a region so thoroughly controlled by the Viet Cong that American commanders had essentially written it off as enemy territory. A battalion-sized force of North Vietnamese regulars was believed to be operating from cave complexes in the area. But every American attempt to locate them had ended in ambush and casualties. Harrington's patrol was tasked with finding the enemy position and calling in an airstrike. What should have been a simple reconnaissance mission turned into something else entirely when they discovered that the North Vietnamese battalion wasn't hiding in caves at all. They were hiding in plain sight, in a village that American intelligence had cleared as friendly. The patrol spent 9 days in the jungle surrounding that village, surviving on cold rations and rainwater, moving only at night, mapping every tunnel entrance, every guard position, and every movement pattern of the enemy force. McAllister was responsible for the southern approach. During those 9 days, he lay motionless for periods lasting up to 16 hours, watching, counting, memorizing. On the 7th day, something happened that would become part of SAS folklore. A North Vietnamese patrol passed within 3 meters of his position. He could see the insects crawling on the lead soldier's neck, could smell the fish sauce on his breath. The patrol stopped directly beside his hide, and one soldier urinated so close that McAllister felt the warmth of it on his arm. He didn't move, didn't breathe, became nothing more than another shadow in the jungle floor. When the intelligence package reached American headquarters, the operations officer initially refused to believe it. He demanded to know how a 5-man patrol could have gathered information that 3 infantry companies and unlimited air support had failed to obtain over 6 months. He asked to meet the patrol commander. Harrington brought McAllister along. The American colonel looked at the young Australian and asked how he'd remained undetected while an enemy soldier literally urinated on him. McAllister's answer became famous. "I wasn't there, sir. I was part of the jungle. The soldier was urinating on a tree." The colonel didn't know how to respond, but he knew he wanted more of whatever the Australians were doing, and what came next would exceed his darkest expectations. Operation Donut was the unofficial name for a joint American-Australian mission into Cambodia during April of 1969. Officially, no such operation existed. Allied forces were strictly prohibited from conducting ground operations in neutral Cambodia, and any incursion would have created an international incident of significant proportions. Unofficially, both American and Australian special forces had been operating in Cambodia for years. These operations were never documented. The men who conducted them were instructed to carry no identification, wear no insignia, and deny everything if captured. They didn't exist, and neither did their missions. Donut was supposed to be simple. Intelligence indicated that a North Vietnamese Army logistics center had been established approximately 14 kilometers inside the Cambodian border. The mission was to locate the facility, photograph it, and, if possible, capture documents that would reveal the supply network's organization. The patrol consisted of 6 men, 4 Australians, including McAllister, and 2 American advisors attached to provide communication support. The American team leader was a captain named Hendricks from MACVSOG, the notorious Studies and Observations Group that conducted America's most classified special operations. His radio operator was a sergeant named Williams, who had requested the attachment specifically because he wanted to see how the Australians worked. What Williams saw would change his understanding of warfare entirely, and what he witnessed on the extraction would haunt him until the day he passed in 2017. But first, everything had to go wrong. The patrol inserted by helicopter at last light on April 11th, landing in a clearing approximately 8 kilometers from the suspected logistics center. They would cover the remaining distance on foot, moving only at night, establishing hide positions during daylight hours. The first indication that something was wrong came within 6 hours of insertion. The jungle ahead of them was too quiet. McAllister, walking point position, raised his fist to halt the patrol and knelt motionless for nearly 3 minutes, listening to nothing. That nothing was the problem. Jungle at night should be filled with sound. Insects, birds, small mammals moving through the undergrowth. This jungle was silent in a way that suggested something had frightened everything into stillness. He signaled the patrol commander, a lieutenant named Fenton. They shifted their route 90 degrees east and continued with extreme caution. The reason for the silence became apparent just before dawn. They had nearly walked into a North Vietnamese army base camp that wasn't on any intelligence report. A camp that appeared to contain at least a company of regular soldiers, possibly more. The patrol went to ground less than 200 meters from the perimeter, concealing themselves in a bamboo thicket that offered excellent concealment but no escape route if they were discovered. They spent the entire day watching the camp, counting personnel, mapping positions, and growing increasingly concerned. The camp sat directly between them and their objective. Going around would add at least 2 days. Going back wasn't an option. The extraction point had already been compromised by their change of route. Fenton made the decision to wait until full dark, then attempt to slip past the camp on its northern edge where the vegetation was thickest. It was a calculated risk, the kind that SAS patrols took routinely. Usually, those risks paid off. This time, fate had other plans. The patrol was approximately 50 meters past the camp's northern perimeter when Williams stepped on a pressure release trigger connected to an illumination flare. The jungle exploded in white light, and suddenly they were visible to everyone within a 200-meter radius. What happened next was controlled chaos. Fenton immediately initiated break contact drills, the patrol splitting into 2-man teams and moving in different directions to confuse pursuers. McAllister grabbed Williams, who was frozen in shock, and dragged him into the jungle as bullets began snapping through the vegetation around them. Hendricks went down in the first seconds, hit in the upper body by at least 2 rounds. One of the other Australians, a corporal named Dwyer, turned back to pull Hendricks to cover and was hit himself. McAllister didn't see what happened to the rest of the patrol. His entire focus narrowed to survival, to moving through the jungle with Williams stumbling behind him, to putting distance between themselves and the sounds of pursuit. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably less than 20 minutes, finally collapsing in a stream bed that offered some concealment. Williams was in bad shape. He hadn't been hit, but he was hyperventilating and on the edge of psychological collapse. McAllister slapped him hard across the face, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, and told him in the calmest voice he could manage that they were going to survive this, but only if Williams did exactly what he said. But survival was still very far from guaranteed. They made contact with Fenton by radio just after midnight. The lieutenant was alive but badly wounded, having taken shrapnel from a grenade during the initial contact. He was with one other survivor, a private named Chen, who had carried him nearly a kilometer before they'd been able to establish a defensive position. Dwyer and Hendricks were confirmed gone. The 6th member of the patrol, a sergeant named Morrison, had disappeared during the break contact and wasn't responding to radio calls. Fenton's assessment was grim. They were deep inside Cambodia with no chance of official rescue. The North Vietnamese knew they were in the area and would be conducting systematic sweeps at first light. Their only hope was to reach the emergency extraction point and pray that someone was willing to send a helicopter across the border to get them. McAllister and Williams reached Fenton's position just before dawn. The lieutenant was worse than he'd described. The shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, and without immediate surgery, he wasn't going to survive more than a day or 2. Fenton knew it. He called McAllister over and gave orders that would later be characterized as the kind of leadership that defines the Australian military tradition. He told McAllister to take the others and move for the extraction point. He would remain behind to delay any pursuit. McAllister refused. In the history of the Special Air Service Regiment, there are very few recorded instances of operators refusing direct orders from their commanders. This was one of them. McAllister told Fenton that they were all leaving together or not at all, and that the lieutenant could either cooperate or be carried unconscious. And then began the longest day of their lives. They fashioned a stretcher from bamboo and began moving toward the extraction point, traveling in daylight because they no longer had the luxury of waiting for darkness. The North Vietnamese would be closing in, and every hour they delayed reduced their chances of survival. The first checkpoint appeared around midday. 4 NVA soldiers at a trail junction positioned to catch anyone trying to move through the area. McAllister halted the group approximately 150 meters from the position and assessed the situation. They could try to go around, but that would cost them at least 2 hours through extremely difficult terrain while carrying a wounded man. They could wait for darkness, but Fenton probably wouldn't survive that long. Or they could go through. He left Williams and Chen with Fenton, took his rifle, and began a flanking approach that would bring him behind the checkpoint. It took 45 minutes to cover the 100 meters through jungle so thick that every step required moving vegetation by hand. When he finally had a clear line of sight to the enemy position, he was less than 30 meters away, close enough to hear them talking, close enough to smell the cigarette smoke drifting through the humid air. He had 17 rounds, 4 targets, Simple mathematics said he could eliminate them all with ammunition to spare. But the sound of gunfire would alert every enemy patrol within a kilometer radius. He decided to try another approach, moving even slower now, controlling every breath. He closed the distance to the nearest soldier until he was within arm's reach. The wire was already in his hands, the handles slick with sweat. The first guard never knew he was there. One moment he was leaning against a tree, watching the trail. The next moment, the wire was around his throat, and McAllister was pulling with every ounce of strength in his body. It was over in seconds. The soldier's struggles were brief and almost silent, just a wet, gurgling sound that didn't carry more than a few meters. 3 more to go. The second guard was more difficult. He was facing the jungle, and McAllister had to approach from an angle that gave the man a chance to see him coming. He didn't. The wire technique worked exactly as Cooley had taught, exactly as McAllister had practiced hundreds of times on training dummies and enemy corpses. The third and fourth guards were sitting together, sharing a meal of rice and dried fish. McAllister eliminated them both in less than 10 seconds, applying the wire to the first while simultaneously driving his knee into the second's throat to prevent him from crying out. It was brutal. It was ugly. And it was absolutely necessary. When he signaled the others to move forward, Williams stared at the 4 bodies with an expression McAllister would see many times in the years to come. It was the look of someone whose understanding of warfare had just been fundamentally altered. But there was no time for reflection. The extraction point was still over a kilometer away, and far worse was waiting ahead. The second checkpoint was larger. 8 soldiers positioned at a stream crossing that offered the only practical route toward the extraction point. Going around this time would require swimming a flooded river with a wounded man who couldn't move under his own power. It wasn't an option. McAllister used his rifle on this one. 8 targets, 17 rounds. He dropped all 8 in less than 5 seconds, the suppressed weapon making sounds no louder than a book being slammed on a table. The technique was called the zipper, a pattern of fire that walked bullets through multiple targets in a single continuous burst. The elimination of the checkpoint allowed them to reach the stream, but it also announced their presence to every enemy unit in the area. From that point forward, they were in a race against time. They crossed the stream with difficulty, Fenton going into shock from the cold water and the continuing blood loss. Chen performed CPR on the far bank, while Williams called desperately for extraction support on frequencies that weren't supposed to be monitored by anyone outside the most classified military units. Someone answered. Williams never learned who, but they promised a helicopter within 90 minutes if the patrol could reach the extraction point and mark it for pickup. 90 minutes, approximately 1.5 kilometers, to cover through jungle that was rapidly filling with enemy soldiers. McAllister did the mathematics and didn't like the results. And then Fenton regained consciousness long enough to say the words that changed everything. "Leave me." That's an order. This time, there was no argument. Fenton was correct. Carrying him was going to get everyone eliminated. But McAllister made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd ever been taught. He told Chen and Williams to continue toward the extraction point with Fenton, while he stayed behind to delay pursuit. It was suicide by any reasonable assessment. One man against an unknown number of enemy soldiers who were actively hunting him in terrain they knew intimately. But McAllister wasn't thinking in reasonable terms anymore. He was thinking in the terms that Billy Doolin had taught him 2 decades earlier on a Queensland cattle station. He was thinking like a hunter. The jungle became his ally. Every shadow, every sound, every shift in the vegetation became information that he processed automatically without conscious thought. He set up an ambush point approximately 300 meters from where he'd separated from the others, and waited. The first North Vietnamese patrol arrived within 15 minutes. 6 soldiers moving in a loose formation, clearly tracking the signs that the stretcher-bearers had left in their haste. McAllister let the first 4 pass his position, then eliminated the trailing 2 with the wire, so quickly and quietly that the soldiers ahead didn't realize anything had happened until they turned around. By then, it was too late for them. He took down 3 more before he ran out of ammunition. The 4th and 5th went down with the wire. The 6th almost escaped, almost made it back the way he'd come, but McAllister ran him down in a sprint that covered 40 meters in what felt like 2 heartbeats. That engagement cost him nearly 20 minutes. He resumed his position closer to the extraction point and waited for the next patrol. But what was coming wasn't a patrol. It was an entire platoon. The extraction point was a natural clearing created by a lightning strike that had burned away the vegetation several years earlier. It was approximately 50 meters across, large enough for a single helicopter to land if the pilot was skilled and the enemy fire wasn't too intense. When McAllister finally reached it, moving through the jungle with the last of his strength, he found Chen waiting alone. Williams had taken Fenton ahead, trying to find a better position for the helicopter to spot them. They hadn't returned. Chen had heard gunfire approximately 10 minutes earlier from the direction they'd gone. McAllister's ammunition was exhausted. His rifle was empty, his pistol was empty, and he had nothing left except his wire collection and a knife that was better suited for cutting vegetation than combat. The extraction helicopter was due in approximately 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes became the longest of his life. The North Vietnamese arrived in force. A full platoon of what appeared to be experienced jungle fighters, who immediately recognized the clearing as the obvious extraction point and began setting up positions to interdict any helicopter that tried to land. McAllister counted them from his concealed position at the clearing's edge. 24 soldiers. Too many to engage even if he'd had ammunition. Far too many to defeat with a wire and a knife. But they didn't know he was there. The jungle had hidden him completely, had made him invisible in the way that Billy Doolin had promised it would, if he learned to be still enough, quiet enough, patient enough. And now, with 12 minutes until extraction, he began to hunt. He began moving around the perimeter of the clearing, using the same techniques that had allowed him to evade capture during selection, that had allowed him to survive 9 days in the long high hills. The North Vietnamese were setting up their ambush positions, focused on the sky and the expected helicopter. They weren't watching the jungle behind them. The first guard was positioned approximately 40 meters from the main body, providing flank security that would have been effective against a conventional approach. McAllister came from above, dropping from a tree branch that he'd climbed without making a sound. The wire was around the man's throat before his feet touched the ground. 11 more to go. The second guard was 20 meters away, close enough to have heard if there had been any sound to hear. There wasn't. McAllister covered the distance in a crouch that kept him below the level of the undergrowth, then rose behind the soldier like something out of a nightmare. 10 more. He worked his way around the perimeter, eliminating guards one by one, moving with a patience and precision that the tactical situation didn't really allow but that his training insisted upon. Each elimination was clean, silent, final. Each body was positioned to look like the soldier had simply fallen asleep at his post. 9, 8, 7. The helicopter appeared on the horizon. 6, 5, 4. The remaining enemy fighters were concentrated at the clearing's center, their attention fixed on the approaching aircraft, completely unaware that half their perimeter security had ceased to exist. 3, 2, 1. 12 guards eliminated in 40 seconds. Not a single alarm raised. Not a single shot fired. And then McAllister broke from the jungle. The helicopter came in fast and low, flaring for a landing that the pilot probably knew was suicidal. McAllister sprinted for the aircraft, while the remaining North Vietnamese soldiers tried to process what was happening. Some turned to fire at the helicopter. Some turned to fire at him. In the confusion, they hit each other as often as they hit their targets. He made the helicopter. So did Chen, who had been hiding in a position on the opposite side of the clearing. Williams appeared from somewhere, dragging Fenton's body, refusing to leave the lieutenant behind even though it was obvious he'd been eliminated in the fighting earlier. The helicopter lifted off under fire, took multiple hits to the fuselage and rotor assembly, and, somehow, kept flying. The pilot, whose name was never recorded in any document that survived, managed to nurse the damaged aircraft across the border into South Vietnam before setting down at a fire support base that wasn't expecting visitors. McAllister was the last conscious member of the patrol when they landed. He'd taken 2 rounds during the sprint to the helicopter, one through the left arm and one that had creased his scalp and left him half blind with blood. He didn't remember the extraction. He didn't remember the medics. He didn't remember anything until he woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed at the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. But the men who witnessed those 40 seconds would never forget. The official record of Operation Donut doesn't exist. No documents, no after-action reports, no commendation citations. Lieutenant Fenton, Corporal Dwyer, Captain Hendricks, and Sergeant Morrison were listed as eliminated in action during operations in South Vietnam. Their families were never told the truth about where they fell. The unofficial record exists in the memories of those who survived, and in a classified assessment prepared by MACVSOG that was never meant to see the light of day. That assessment, portions of which were leaked to journalists in the 1980s, described the Australian SAS methods employed during the extraction as highly effective but unsuitable for adoption by American forces due to their intensity and the psychological demands they place on operators. The assessment noted that Sergeant McAllister's elimination of 12 enemy personnel using a wire garrote in conditions that should have made such actions impossible demonstrated a level of capability that we do not currently possess and cannot train for using conventional methods. In other words, the Pentagon wanted to learn what the Australians knew, but didn't want anyone to know they were learning it. And the man who had demonstrated those capabilities. He was already planning his return to the jungle. McAllister recovered from his wounds and returned to operations within 2 months. He completed 3 more tours in Vietnam before the Australian withdrawal in 1971, accumulating a record that remains classified to this day. Soldiers who served with him describe operations that sound more like horror stories than military history. Night missions where entire enemy units simply disappeared. Interrogations that produced intelligence no other method could obtain. And body displays that terrorized the Viet Cong in ways that American forces never managed. He was never charged with any violation of the rules of engagement. He was never investigated for misconduct. The methods he employed were officially unknown, because the operations in which he employed them were officially non-existent. Williams survived Vietnam and spent the rest of his military career trying to understand what he'd witnessed. He requested access to Australian SAS training programs. He was denied. He asked to be attached to Australian units during joint exercises. He was told no such attachments were available. He wrote a detailed account of the operation and submitted it through classified channels, hoping it would eventually reach historians who could place it in context. That account disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that consumed so many inconvenient truths about the Vietnam War. But before he passed in 2017, Williams gave one final interview to a military historian who had earned his trust over decades of careful research. What he said in that interview explains why this story matters. Williams described McAllister as something other than a soldier. He was more like a force of nature that had learned to wear a uniform. The way he moved, the way he worked, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't anything I'd ever imagined. We talked about jungle warfare like we understood it. The Australians actually lived it. The rivalry between American and Australian special forces continued long after Vietnam ended. American units eventually adopted some of the techniques that the Australians had pioneered, incorporating elements of their tracking methods, their small unit tactics, and their approach to psychological warfare into training programs that carefully avoided acknowledging where the ideas had originated. The wire technique was never officially adopted by any American unit. It was considered too personal, too disturbing, and too difficult to train for. But soldiers who served in the conflicts that followed Vietnam, from various theaters across the globe, occasionally reported encounters with individuals who seemed to possess skills that didn't quite fit the official curriculum. When asked where they'd learned such things, they typically smiled and said something about a book they'd read or an instructor they'd met. The Australians, true to their tradition, never took credit and never sought recognition. They simply did the job, in the shadows where the real work of special operations has always been done. David McAllister left the Australian Army in 1974, with the rank of warrant officer and a chest full of medals that he never wore. He returned to the Queensland cattle station where he'd grown up, took over the operation from his aging parents, and spent the next 40 years raising sheep and cattle on land that had been in his family for 4 generations. He never spoke publicly about his service in Vietnam. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never participated in any of the reunions that brought together veterans of the SAS regiment. When journalists occasionally tracked him down, seeking the story behind the statistics and the rumors, he politely declined to discuss his military career and offered them tea on his veranda while pointing out the various features of the landscape that had shaped his childhood. Billy Doolan passed in 1982, and McAllister was one of only a handful of non-Aboriginal people invited to the funeral ceremony. Whatever the old tracker had taught the young grazier's son, whatever methods he'd passed down from 40,000 years of hunting tradition, they remained between the two of them. The wire collection, all 14 garrotes that McAllister had carried through his final years in Vietnam, hung in a wooden case on the wall of his study until his own passing in 2019. His children, who knew only the vaguest outlines of their father's military service, asked what they were. He told them they were souvenirs from a different life, a life that had ended long ago and that he preferred not to think about. But the truth, hidden in those 14 lengths of thin wire, told a different story entirely. One of his granddaughters, curious about family history, eventually submitted requests through the Australian War Memorial for her grandfather's service record. Most of it remained classified. What she received was a single page noting that Warrant Officer David Arthur McAllister had served with distinction in Vietnam and had been awarded several decorations, including the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the highest award for gallantry that could be given to an enlisted soldier. The citation for that medal, the reasons he received it, and the operations in which he earned it remain secret to this day. But the men who served alongside him know the truth. The few who are still alive to remember, they know exactly what happened in those jungles. They know about the 9 days in the long high hills. They know about the checkpoints that were cleared without a shot being fired. They know about the 40 seconds that should have been impossible. And they know about a sheep farmer from Queensland who learned to hunt humans the way his ancestors had hunted prey for 40,000 years. 200 yards from safety, out of ammunition, facing 12 armed guards who stood between him and the extraction helicopter. 40 seconds later, the guards were eliminated, and David McAllister was sprinting through the clearing toward an aircraft that shouldn't have been there, flown by a pilot whose name was never recorded, on a mission that officially never happened. That's the story of Operation Donut. That's the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. That's the story that the Pentagon classified and Canberra preferred to forget. Somewhere in Queensland, on a cattle station that has been in the same family for over a century, a wooden case containing 14 lengths of thin wire still hangs on a study wall. The grandchildren don't know what it means, but now you do. Ma Rung, the jungle ghost. 200 yards never seemed so far. 40 seconds never passed so slowly. And the truth, buried under more than 50 years of classification and denial, finally sees the light of day.